Now, are we going to be ready for November for Mr. Xi Jinping's deadline? No. And that's a worry, right? So what else can, coming back to your earlier question, what else can China extract for that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, how far can it go? Of course, China would love to extract, all the islands of Western Pacific, including the largest one. It's probably unlikely to happen.
They're going to keep at it. They're going to keep pushing. And I don't think there's any doubt that that's going to stop anytime soon. It's always educational to talk to you. And this was wildly fascinating, at least from our end.
Yeah, this has been incredible. I've learned more in the last 30 minutes than I have in I don't know how long.
Certainly.
And you're reading the book, so that's...
Yeah, and I'm reading the book too, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I learned more chemistry in the last 30 minutes than I did in high school. But
it's useful.
Yeah.
It's useful.
Welcome to On the Fringe. I'm Gavin Lucky, here with Dave. And today on our podcast, we have Tomasz Nadrowski, who Dave is going to introduce here. And we're here to talk about a lot of things. Dave, let's just start it off.
Yeah, so we're excited to have Tomasz on the podcast today. Tomasz is a portfolio manager at Amvest Capital. He's a CFA charter holder. He holds dual masters in the arts and public administration from the University of Geneva. He has 25 years of experience in mining and minerals. So he was a former director at the World Economic Forum, and he was also the VP of Business Development at Anglo Gold Ashanti. He is the author of a book, Mineral War. It's an awesome book, started reading it, and he's also a podcast host of Tyranny Today. And he speaks a bunch of languages. So Tomasz he's an incredible person that we're very, very privileged and very excited to talk to today. And first, we'd like to just kind of jump into the chokehold theory about what happens if one country or one key resource is essentially held by one party, or it's not able to get out to the market as it has in the past.
Thanks. First of all, thank you for the invitation, Davis and Gavin. Appreciate it. Great to be here with us. Feliz Cinco de Mayo, by the way. We have some listeners in Mexico. Okay, chokehold theory. That's the idea of affecting the flows rather than the stocks. So the flows in the stocks, economics works on that, but geostrategy as well, and geoeconomics as well. What is geoeconomics? It's using economic levers to achieve other strategic goals. And of course, affecting the flows, inflows and outflows really matters. When we look at the Straits of Hormuz, this is, of course, the classic Admiralty sanctions style chokehold. So classic meaning affecting the Navy and the movement of maritime straits, corridors. Hormuz is one of those, probably 6 or 7 natural ones that are very important, plus 2 vital canals as well. The idea is not new. The idea goes back to some naval theories of late 19th and early 20th century. There was some opposition, I actually recently thought about it, in relation to this war between the idea of Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose view on naval superiority was massive force, massive destruction, and sort of occupation of certain areas. And against that came the idea of Julian Corbett, another naval theorist, who felt, no, you cannot really occupy the oceans. So what matters is the lines of communication. So instead of being in 2D environment, like you can when you occupy some land, when it comes to flows of material over maritime routes, that's really just a 1D flow from point A to point B. And so raids, piracy, corsairs, blockades, quarantines, they all fall into this category. This is the literal view of chokeholds and really affects the maritime trade as we're seeing right now. Unfortunately, not just oil or oil and natural gas, LNG, also sulfur. Great importance for mining. We can talk about it, but later. Helium as well, vital for semiconductor production, and aluminum, or as well alumina, both of which are important products in the Gulf and have been for many years, actually since late 1970s already, because of stranded energy there. But that's one view of chokeholds, so the literal view of flows floating on a liquid salty ocean. But the other way is, of course, constraining flows in a more metaphoric way, whatever the actual medium that carries them. And here, I think we learned the hard way last year, and this is where the book ends at the end of 2025, when China leveraged its monopoly or near monopoly in several critical minerals, most notably rare earths, by choking off outflow of these minerals. So monopolizing them now, and that's a process took about 30 years, and then weaponizing that monopoly by deciding that parties with which China has some rivalry, sometimes strategic rivalry, sometimes worse than rivalry, would not be allowed to obtain those. Some of those jurisdictions, including Europe, Japan, the United States, are very dependent on inflows of those critical minerals, both for civilian use and for military use as well, so dual use in general. And so when United States, just to remind everybody, because it's important, the story is not over, but last year in 2025, the U.S. government tried to rebalance the somewhat lopsided trade relationship with China. This was the second attempt in about a decade, and China was ready with its own chokehold, ready with weaponized critical minerals, pushed back on two occasions, first in April in reaction to the Liberation Day, the so-called Liberation Day announced in the Rose Garden, and then escalating again in the run-up to the meeting in Busan in Korea between Xi Jinping and Trump, escalating because adding additional elements that were restricted for exports. And by the way, this is a process that took many years. I observed it in the Chinese case since 2020 in some detail, as my fund invests in these materials outside of the Chinese value chain. And what happened in 2020, China gave itself a law called export control law that gives them sort of a legal fig leaf to weaponize different products as China continues to accumulate productive manufacturing power way above the size of its economy on the global scale. So it's an economy that represents 17% of global GDP, some 32% of global manufacturing, and planning to reach 40. But in terms of metal production, it's often 60, 70, 90, 99%, way ahead of its own domestic consumption. So China decided to weaponize it, and what happened in Busan is that the United States and the world, because the restrictions were not U.S.-centric, were granted a reprieve, a suspension of 4 out of 24 different restrictions for 12 months. So we are roughly halfway through this period, and let's see what happens between now and November.
Do you think there's any incentive for the Chinese government to extend that, or do you think it's pretty unlikely?
Well, that depends what's in the quiver for China and what their list of deliverables are from,
Hmm.
kowtowing governments around the world. Some governments are more pliable than others because the level and the challenge, strategic challenge, differs vis-a-vis
Hmm.
China. For United States, a little different than for Japan. Japan has been on the receiving end of very harsh restrictions since the beginning of this year again. So this is sort of Japan-specific set of restrictions that affects rare earths as well. And so after several attempts to find an off-ramp with the regime in Beijing, it seems like Japan basically has given up on that and has recently just fanned out, just last week, around the world with the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister traveling all around the world and sort of trying to figure out what are the best solutions to alleviate the pain in the energy markets, especially for Southeast Asian allies, and of course Australia as well, and even Central Asia, where ADB had a meeting, the Asian Development Bank, still US and Japan being the largest shareholders of this bank. So that's Japan's reaction. And in terms of US, we'll see. As you know, the approach that the US government has taken since November is to speak very softly to China. Every single connection is the best ever, and everything is just fantastic. We'll see how it goes, because at the end of the day, we also see elements of tightening the news on both sides.
Hmm.
U.S. that's related to sanctions on some of the refiners in China, private refiners, some of the larger ones in Shandong, for example, including also some of the teapot ones. Some of them have been already sanctioned by the EU because of their deals with Russia. So it's not entirely new. China has just announced that these companies should ignore those sanctions. Well, the problem if you trade products, refined products, is that you might ignore it as much as you want, but your counterparties also should ignore it.
Yeah.
And the counterparties will be, in Vietnam or Philippines or Indonesia, they might be unwilling to lose access to US dollar flow. So we'll see how that goes. It's one of the sort of tugs of war. And of course, China has had its own slew of escalatory measures in anticipation of this still scheduled meeting with Trump in 2 weeks from now, including, of course, the blocking of Facebook's acquisition of an AI play in China, and also further restrictions on critical minerals producers, so those producers who allegedly do not comply with production quotas. So to understand that system is that China lost a case, well, several cases at WTO in the early 2010s, following the complaints from Japan, Europe, and US regarding its earlier restrictions on exports in 2010. And ever since export quotas are illegal within the old GATT system, WTO today, China just simply moved from restricting exports to restricting production, and then basically allocating production quota to different operators that allowed the government to consolidate a rare earth industry, which was very dispersed, especially in the southern part of the country. There are two systems, two different geological, two different systems in the north and in the south. And southern part was very much dominated for a long time by small private operators in Jiangxi province, and sometimes a little further south in Yunnan, and some of them also spilling over to Myanmar. But that consolidation meant to first create larger groups than would be merged with arms, rare earth producing arms of much larger SOEs, and then eventually state-owned enterprises would take them over. And so that process, about probably three legs of that, last one after COVID, quite successful, but there are still some independent, quasi-independent, small producers, and they of course, want to produce over and above the quota. There's some allegations that probably some of them are trying to smuggle the product outside of the PRC. That's of course not acceptable to the regime. So there was this crackdown at the end of April, which, by the way, boosted the share prices of those state-owned enterprises, chunks of which are listed in Shenzhen and Shanghai. So they had a bit of a rally in April because the assumption is, well, they will control even more of the Chinese rare earth production.
Yeah, I think you hit on a big point there where 10, 15 years ago, it would have been easier to smuggle these out by using smaller parties or by using third parties. And in the last couple of years, the CCP really has tightened its stranglehold on smaller companies and also on the financial system within China, where they're stricter, from my understanding, too, about currency controls, where if you want to send money outside of China, it's much harder to do than it was in the past. And they're trying to essentially have more state control over their financial system and over key resources and keeping that all in China for the CCP to have as levers for economic warfare, for improving the economy.
This is very true. So just from my own observations, when I travel around East Asia, it's amazing how many people are making money on helping Chinese to take the money out, right? We bounce on this because we're trying to raise funds, of course, in different places, and constantly there is some, great outlet there. On the control inside, I to say that the balance sheets of most of the companies today are really owned by state-owned banks. There's very, very little independent financing possible other than some traditional mutual financing that always existed in Chinese culture that predates communism by centuries. There is a capital market there as well. But even in the capital market, over 80% of that capital is allocated to state-owned enterprises. So essentially, it always surprised me when I used to work there and visit, large banks, state-owned banks, is that they didn't have risk management desk. Why do you need a risk management desk if everything is decided? If this is
Yeah.
how you live it. Hence, overcapitalization of this economy, this massive overhang from non-performing fixed asset investment, 330% debt to GDP, which is just staggering for an economy at this level of development in terms of GDP per capita.
Wow. And something just picking up from what Dave said, there's also been, from my perception, a crackdown on potential partners for these groups outside of China, where, you were talking about the smaller businesses in Yunnan, for example, and how there was that spillover into Myanmar in some cases. I know this was true for a lot of smaller enterprises of this kind, not just with Myanmar, but with businesses in Cambodia, businesses in the Philippines. There were potential outlays for capital in China. Those options are no longer there in many cases because the Chinese government, again, in my understanding, is much more aggressive about controlling capital once it leaves
Mm-hmm.
and how it's sort of allowed to accrue outside of the PRC. And, sometimes I feel like in the West, this is viewed as they're being expansionist, but I'm not sure that's how it's viewed within the country. Have you noticed that as well?
Yes, that has the problem with internationalization of renminbi, right? It's either or.
Mm,
Either you let it actually flow, and just like US dollar, there's more US dollars circulating outside of the US economy than in US, naturally, because outside of the United States is larger. So you have that. I just saw the comparison for crypto. So the stable coins
mm,
backing. I mean, US is already around $350 billion of backing of stable coins. All the others, including euro being the second largest currency in the world, it's just minuscule. So everything that comes always starts with the dollar liquidity. You cannot have it if they have this anal attitude to control
yeah.
of the monetary base, whether it's in or outside of the country. It just cannot happen. Just on the mining side, because you mentioned Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, there's activity there, both in rare earths as well as tungsten and tin. That is easier to control because you need this physical flow to move back into the Chinese system. So you need to
Mm,
still separate and refine these materials inside China because this is where the refining producing hub is. You don't really do this in Southeast Asian countries. So it's up to the Southeast Asian countries then to decide, okay, are we just vassals, just
mm,
producing pure commodities, which probably is the case of Cambodia and Laos, sadly, for both of these countries. Or am I sitting on the fence as Malaysia, as I was just there, 2 weeks ago? And very interesting
mm,
conversations about that. I fear it worse than that. That has not happened. Obviously, Malaysia believes that they have some cards to play and rejected MOU with China when Xi Jinping visited the country about a couple of months last year, last calendar year. There was an attempt of a quid pro quo. Okay, we, the Chinese, will provide you with technology to process ionic adsorption clays, which is a very specific type of deposits for rare earths. And you will provide us with feedstock that's rich in heavy rare earths that are really important for, high-end applications and high-end magnets and so on. And that failed through, and instead, Malaysia decided to kind of play both ways. They have a significant Australian company that's embedded there, producing and separating the rare earths for the Japanese market predominantly, but for US as well. And yeah, they kind of decided to stay, in the middle. And then you have, of course, the Philippines, which are trying to push back in many ways against the encroachment, at least under current administration. So different reactions to this. I found that my European friends who are very idealistic and seriously disturbed by certain developments in the United States expected me to come back from East Asia and tell them that, there's a very strong anti-American feel that. But in the Asian basin, it's very different because, of course, you deal every day with, a much bigger power just next door. And any attempt at balancing this, in this case by the United States, is actually welcomed by most of those countries. Now, the style, how it happens, to different story, of course.
I'm having a thought right now. And we were talking earlier, and you were saying that Malaysia is one of the few countries that you were saying that there's an Australian mining company that's in Malaysia that is really keeping Japan's semiconductor industry to where it's able to operate without being fully under control of dependence on Chinese supply of rare earth minerals. So, are there any other countries or any other, I would say, parts of the world that have the capabilities to step in case the Chinese are closing off the entire supply chain?
Okay, let me just correct one thing. So it's not
Sure,
necessarily
sure, sure.
semiconductor business. We're talking about sintered and bonded magnets that go into just about everything electric,
Hmm.
or probably
Mm.
half of everything that's electric. So embedded in electric motors, very important, of course, not just
Right.
for EVs, but for wind power, but just about anything that requires some transformation of magnetic power into electric. In terms of Malaysia's role, it is key, and the company, Australian company, Lynas, 15 years ago was saved by Japanese business after that massive increase in rare earth prices that subsequently crashed post um, attempt by China to weaponize this in relations with Japan. Japan being always the largest client because the second largest producer of magnets after China. So they need those rare earth oxides. The plant has been in Malaysia for 15, 16 years. It separates rare earths, light rare earths for a long time, neodymium, praseodymium, and as of September, October of last year, also some heavy rare earths. It's not yet full scale, but I
Mm.
saw it. It does happen. So they have terbium and dysprosium and samarium oxides. Extremely important. Terbium and dysprosium are important for doping high-end sintered magnets, so all of those that are required to survive high temperatures to some other harsh environments, including radioactivity. Of course, you would know that would be dual use. Samarium goes into a different type of magnet with cobalt, also used in aerospace. So the question is like, who else other than Malaysia is there outside of China? And there's only one other plant like this, and it's a plant in Estonia run by a Canadian company, Neo Performance. The plant has an interesting story. Actually, it was built as an oil refining unit in independent Estonia between the wars by the Wallenbergs, the Swedish billionaires. And then it survived into the Soviet Union, but it was used for uranium processing.
Mm.
And then since the 1990s, there were several iterations with, of course, changes of ownership a couple of times, a couple of oligarchs that went through it, but today it functions as a rare earth plant with a magnet plant nearby. All of this run by this excellent company called Neo Performance, which until recently also had separation plants in China, including heavy rare earth separation plants, but they were forced to sell it for a song as China decided to completely separate themselves from any Western operators. I think they have single-digit minority left there, but I doubt there is a product. Some of this information is not public, so I'm guessing here what
Hmm.
happens to that equity product from China. The other problem with the Estonian plant is that they're looking for feedstock from around the world, and for historical reasons, there's a legacy source of feedstock, and that comes from Russia. So over 4 years into the war, 4 years into the war, you still have Russian material for separation in an Estonian plant, believe it or not. So this is how quixotic it is. It's like the U.S. still imports enriched uranium from Russia and titanium metal. It's difficult to onshore everything overnight, even if the night lasts 4 years and 2 months.
Really? So, I mean, again, I think it's one of those things where people might have this sort of abstract vision. We talk about the chokehold theory, we talk about all these flows of critical minerals. But I think to actually hear, for example, what you were just talking about, and that's one example out of many, where you only have two plants in the world outside of China that really do this thing that we're kind of all dependent on, whether we know it or not. I mean, those are magnets that are being used in very critical parts of the economy that we're all very dependent on. And yet, there are two plants. Okay, Malaysia, maybe not so much, but Estonia, describing Estonia as being slightly on the front line is maybe not an exaggeration. It's certainly sort of on the hard end of NATO right now. Should people be more concerned than they are, is I guess my question.
So I think people are very concerned. I wouldn't underestimate either of those locations. China
Hmm.
cultivates always pro-Chinese forces all around Asia. It's true in South Korea, it's true in Taiwan, it's true in the Philippines, and it's certainly true in Malaysia too, right? So one day there could be
Hmm.
a government comes back and says, hey, you know what? We don't like those radionuclides that you're processing, that you're cracking and leaching plant. We shut it down. It happened before. It could happen again. So depending, who the pro-Chinese
Hmm.
party is. In Estonia, you're right. This is right on the front line. That magnet plant is actually right on the border of Narva river.
Oh,
So, as you know, 2 years ago, Russian army removed the buoys there that block
yeah.
the border. So, according to Russians, there is no border anymore, and it's a
Mhm.
Russian-speaking town. So, the scary scenario is that one day the town wakes up surrounded by little green men, and here we go. The plant is gone. I guess it's a little more complicated. I don't think Russia is in the best spot right now in the war
Hmm.
with Ukraine. Some cracks there and in the Kremlin. Let's see how the parade goes in 4 years, 4 days from now. So it's probably less of a risk right now, but
Hmm.
the country hasn't yet said its last word, and Estonia definitely is in
No.
the crosshairs. But yes, we are concerned, and there is an accelerated effort right now to build new plants. One in Australia with significant input from the Australian government, because otherwise it wouldn't necessarily be very profitable to build it, not to operate it, but to build it. And that's going to use an existing stockpile by a company that would be able then to import feedstock from other new junior miners that are developing projects around the world. Utah has a plant that can function either as a uranium plant or rare earth plant. That's actually a good thing because this company, Energy Fuels, would know how to manage a class 7 material. This is often a problem when you process rare earths because it comes with radionuclides, not least monazite, one of the minerals, and sometimes also ionic clays. It's a problem if you don't have the skills, if you cannot really deal with the costs of doing this, and if you don't have
Hmm.
legislation that makes it clear what you do with radioactive waste. Both the US and especially Europe have a problem with this, and I think should really fast track some overhauling of these regulations specifically for this industry. Europe actually has quite a bit of institutional memory that survived. So people who were doing this 40 years ago are still alive. They are engaged in developing a center in Lac in southern France, and a lot of other parties, including the Japanese, including Australians, including Americans now, and also Brazilian projects are involved in that. So this would become one of the hubs when it's ready. Of course, in Europe, in order to receive any money to do this, you have to first say, I'm going to recycle. So recycled material first. But the problem with magnets is that for these magnets to be high performing, it's not enough to have recycled material. You need fresh oxide as well. So you cannot just bypass mining completely. So there are a number of efforts. Also in Norway, although they've been playing around with some novel flow sheets, it's taken 15 years. I don't know. Rich people, maybe they have a lot of time. There's another project potentially in Poland for a source of material in Malawi that I saw late last year in Malawi. Very interesting deposit that might lead to somewhere, and that's adjacent to a large fertilizer plant, one of the largest in Europe. So that's the way to do it, sort of grafting this
Hmm.
on existing brownfields capacity when you have some human skills, when you can, benefit from some connectivity with existing business. So that would be a smart thing to do. It's still far away from being executed. So and you have efforts in Canada as well, many other parts of the United States. So something's happening. I think when you look at this value chain, you have to find out where are those holes. I call them, this is Emmentaler cheese, right, with big holes. I'm from Switzerland, so that's a metaphor that works for me, maybe not everybody else, but there are big holes in this value chain. And I have to say metallization is the biggest problem for the West. So once you have separated these into separate oxides, say terbium or dysprosium or something, in order to actually make them into magnet, you have to metallize it. And it's such a low margin business that it has all been concentrated in Vietnam, a little bit in Thailand,
Oh,
because it's labor intensive and you don't make any money on it. So even the Japanese and the Australians who always work together on that, even they have concentrated their own node in Vietnam. Now I hear, I mean, I don't have any clearance, so I don't know actually what's classified, but I hear that there are some efforts in US as well to build metallization capacity inside the United States with some DOW input, but this is not public, so I have no further information about it. But it shows that people are thinking, that there's,
hmm.
where the holes are and what needs to be done. Now, are we going to be ready for November for Mr. Xi Jinping's deadline? No. And that's a worry, right? So what else can, but coming back to your earlier question, what else can China extract for that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, how far can it go? Of course, China would love to extract, all the islands of Western Pacific, including the largest one. It's probably unlikely to happen.
But they're gonna keep at it. They're gonna keep pushing. And I don't think there's
Absolutely.
any doubt that that's going to stop anytime soon. Thank you so much for coming on today, Tomas. It's been just it's always educational to talk to you, and this was wildly fascinating, at least from our end.
Yeah, this has been incredible. I've learned more in the last 30 minutes than I have in I don't know how long.
Oh,
Well, certainly,
and you're reading the book, so
Yeah, and I'm reading the book too. Yeah.
and I got to start now. Yeah, I was gonna say I think I learned more chemistry in the last 30 minutes than I did in high school. Um,
it's
but
useful.
yeah,
It's useful. When you do this for a living, you suddenly realize that the table of elements is probably one of the most genius things that we ever invented or discovered. Hard to say. It's just it. If you start digging into semiconductors or why certain things have to be allied together to achieve certain performance, and you suddenly see it, diagonally somewhere in this, it's like that makes perfect sense. That's it's quite remarkable. And probably the most important Russian mind ever that served all of us and not just Russians, Mendeleev.
anyways, again, thank you so much. And to all our listeners, please listen to Tomas's podcast, read the book. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share with your friends. Thank you for being with us here on the Fringe. Take us away, Dave.
Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Lewis.
Thank you.
Do I have to say it? Hit the button.
I did hit the button. There we go.